In this edition of Locked On Capitals, Roman Stubbs of the Washington Post comes on the show, and we do a season wrap on a disappointing season for the Capitals and what lies ahead next on Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about the coaching changes around the Caps and what that means going forward. We talk about the fact that Wilson is going to be a UFA after next season. How crazy is that? We'll talk about the future plans of Kuznetsov and Backstrom. In this episode, we are happy to have Roman Stubbs of the Washington Post. Roman, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So just taking a look at the coaching thing, how surprised were you when you found out the Capitals and Peter Laviolette parted ways?
Oh, not surprised at all. I mean, I think it could have went either way there for a while down the stretch. Even, Brian Maclellan acknowledged that they were open to discussing a possible extension with Peter after the season. But I just think that both parties had gotten to the point where, the Capitals needed to move on. And I think Peter also had realized that maybe it just wasn't going to work here. He had there was a lot of issues that he encountered over his 3 years. A lot's been made about the injuries and never having a full lineup and all of that. But, this is a franchise that's in a really unique position right now in terms of their age. You have a player who is chasing a really historic record, and then you're trying to get younger. And so you have this confluence of issues that a coach has to deal with. And I think both parties after a really exhausting and difficult year just felt like it was time to maybe cut their losses. So not surprised on that end. It was hard to tell down the stretch just where the team's mood was at. I mean, some nights they played really inspired hockey, even when they were eliminated. Other nights they looked completely disinterested. So I think a coaching change at this juncture will hopefully for this team provide some energy that just wasn't going to maybe happen if Laviolette had come back.
It was a tough thing for me because, Peter Laviolette is the winningest born U.S. coach and is 8th all time in wins. So, I'm thinking to myself, these guys don't exactly grow on trees, and it's not like it's always plug and play. But I think, changes need to be made. And the last time the Capitals missed the playoffs was in 2014 when Adam Oates was behind the bench. And subsequently, that was his last season with the Caps as well. So an interesting thing, I guess what's hard about it for me is the fact that there was COVID and the myriad of injuries that he faced. And he knew his contract was set to expire on June 30th. So I think that he saw the writing on the walls. And I don't think that even if they wanted him back, I don't think he wanted to sign up for round 2 of this, just based on the fact that this team is getting old and all that kind of thing. So it was a tough thing going forward, but there are some intriguing names out there for sure. Todd Nelson, Jeff Halpern, and Spencer Carberry are kind of the front runners that I'm hearing. Do you have any favorites on who you think would be the next head coach of the Caps?
Well, I think it's those 3 guys. It's going to be really interesting to see, how this Toronto Tampa Bay series, winds up. You have Carberry and Halpern obviously in the playoffs right now. And it's going to be, I think it's interesting, obviously, with these guys, having roots with the franchise, having experience here. Obviously, Halpern's from Maryland, former captain of the organization. He's had so much success on John Cooper's staff, and seems like he's in line for a job somewhere. And it seems like it lines up here in Washington. With Carberry, a guy who knows the players who are in Washington's pipeline right now. He knows what's on the farm, and that's what they need. They need somebody who can identify the youth in this organization and what's going to maybe work for them in building for the future. I think both of these guys understand that, but Carberry seems to understand that, and then Nelson obviously is in Hershey right now, and so he's got a grip on how Protas plays and Alexiev and who's down there right now with McMichael and Frank and all these guys who could figure into the future. And so I think there's a lot of intangibles like that are going to be intriguing. I think it's definitely possible that we see maybe a name that isn't popping up right now. And it, I don't think you can count that out either. So, I think they've got an idea of who they would like or at least who they'd like to interview. And, it was interesting to hear Maclellan say last week that, look, 3 years ago, we were looking for a veteran coach. We knew exactly the mold, the type of coach that we needed in here after Todd Reardon. And now they're kind of going back to more of an open-minded approach on, hey, we can be really flexible here. Again, it's got to be a coach who's willing to come in and inherit a really unique situation. And so you almost have to find a coach who's flexible, who can relate with a veteran locker room, but also be able to reach out to younger players and develop younger players and bridge that gap. So it's definitely a unique situation. It's going to take a unique coach. And, I'm really intrigued to see what happens.
Yeah, it was one of the things he said, that I'm looking for someone to work with the older players and the young players. He goes, I'm going to do my darndest to find it. I don't know if this guy exists, but they hope that they can.
Yeah.
An interesting thing there too is that Connor McMichael and Hendrix Lapierre, Vinny Iorio, all these guys down in Hershey that just seem on the cusp. There's always been some reluctance with Peter Laviolette and Barry Trotz, a couple coaches before that, to get younger. For me, I think that is going to be, the secret sauce for this next coach is that he can finally find a way to get some of these younger players integrated. Because if you take a look at the lineup right now, Martin Faravari has been the first player in quite some time to have a job night in and night out since you want to go back to almost like Wilson or Holtby. I know that, Protas and those guys are kind of in and out of the lineup, but just to kind of speak to how rare it is for, these younger guys to actually work their way up and have regular jobs on the Capitals on a night in, night out basis. I think that almost kind of is the front burner thing over everything else, is to finally get these players that we hear about in Hershey up on this big team. Because, if there's ever a time to kind of, I hate to say rebuild, because they said it's more of a retool, which kind of just seems semantics to me. But do you think that would be the biggest thing, is having a head coach that can, work the younger players in?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to have to be. I mean, I think this year we saw the shortcomings of this team's, issues. I think obviously a lot was made about the speed and the aging of the roster. What we're finding is that a lot of these guys are on different schedules, and so it's something that maybe you could correlate the injury issues back to their age and whatnot. But I think to find the depth and to find that spark and to find, to find an energy that maybe they didn't have this year, they're going to have to be able to replenish the lineup with their prospects. Who that is going to be fun to watch. I mean, there's a lot of talent in Hershey. They've got a ton of draft picks, draft capital that that will come into play for the future as well down the line, 4, 5, 6 years down the line. So the future for the franchise is really intriguing, but I think the immediate question is how do they fit in some of these guys from Hershey, and how does the new coach do that? I think maybe the criticism of Peter Laviolette being hesitant on younger players was maybe a little overblown. I mean, I think he picked his spots with certain guys. I mean, I think, like Alexiev and Faravari, I mean, I think those are guys he ended up really leaning on down the stretch in this year. But, I think it's going to probably take a coach who is maybe a little less loyal to this veteran core, or at least, the philosophy of sticking with veterans over younger players, and maybe just finding the right balance. I mean, that's the question for every coach, right? Is how do you balance those two concepts? And so, it's definitely probably an exciting time for the prospects to see new blood coming in, and to see maybe how this is going to look in training camp with a new coaching staff. Even TJ Oshie said the other day is, it's an exciting thing for a player to come into training camp with a new coach, because they have to prove themselves all over again, and it's a chance to show themselves as somebody who can really contribute. I mean, it's a daunting challenge, but it's also an exciting opportunity for everybody. And so even guys like Kuznetsov and Anthony Mantha and some of these guys who maybe had down years, it's an opportunity. And so we'll see how that kind of correlates with the guys from Hershey who are going to get a look here in September.
And it wasn't just the changes there. Then shortly thereafter, Forsyth and McCarthy were also shown the door. They didn't get new contracts either. So Blaine Forsyth is a guy that kind of gets a lot of, the ire thrown at him about how he's predictable and all that kind of thing with the power play. He spent 17 years in Washington working his way up from the video coach. But an interesting statistic that I read here, to be exact, Alex Ovechkin scored 188 of his NHL record 299 power play goals in the 11 seasons Forsyth was in charge. So despite the fact that maybe he lost his effectiveness, and, I read the piece that Tarek put out there that he was saying that, sometimes the plays weren't always executed exactly the way that they wanted to do them. What would talk to me about your thoughts on Blaine Forsyth? He's kind of one of these guys you hear a lot about on Twitter, that if there's one guy that's got to go, it's got to be Blaine Forsyth. Was he as bad as everyone thought he was?
Well, I mean, I don't think that would be for me to say. I mean, I think it's really fascinating to jump on a beat and to see how fan bases kind of latch on to certain things. I mean, it's probably like, running a power play for, I don't know, for an NHL team, or at least a big NHL team is probably like being a offensive coordinator in the SEC or something. Everybody's always calling for your job. But like you said, I mean, to be the architect of, or at least to be kind of behind Ovechkin's, the design of Ovechkin's, kind of his power play body of work in terms of goals is something to be noted. And I mean, I think he, for a lot of years was leading one of the top power plays in the league. I think people forget his work during the Stanley Cup run, which, this team reached the pinnacle of the sport. And so, I think it's just probably it probably more underscores how professional sports works, and how fan bases work, and how they turn on coaching staffs, and how, the pressure for success is always there. And so I think, he would admit that. I think everybody would admit that it's a results driven business. I got the sense that he was just a really, really respected person in that building, and somebody who had the institutional knowledge and the history that dates back. I mean, 17 years is 17 years. And so, I think that's an amazing run, and it's something to tip your cap to. And, I'm going to be fascinated and definitely encouraged, or at least going to want to see where he ends up and wish him the best. So yeah, it's something that I think even if you look at some of these coaches, Carberry, obviously is a guy who has been the architect of a power play up in Toronto, and they've had a very effective power play. And so, that could come into, kind of the decision-making too, is how, some of these coaching changes that they've had under Laviolette with McCarthy and whatnot, how that's going to be filled with the new coach coming in. And so that'll definitely be something of interest as well. So, yeah, it's a lot of changes happening, and we'll see what happens from here.
All right, so after the break here, we're going to talk about Tom Wilson and how he is going to be a UFA after the end of next season. What does that mean for the Capitals? We'll talk about that straight ahead. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits the first time. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know if the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop at eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when you have the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure and subscribe, as I have some other big guests on the show. I'll have Matt Wyrick, John Walton, and Mike Vogel, so make sure and subscribe today. In this episode, we have Roman Stubbs of the Washington Post, and we're really happy to have him here. Let's talk for a moment here about Tom Wilson. Earlier in this off season here, I talked about my three untouchables. It was Alex Ovechkin, Tom Wilson, and John Carlson, and that was it. Let's face it. I think this team needs to get really shook up. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want Nick Backstrom and TJ Oshie to go out of here for nothing. But Tom Wilson is one of the guys, other than Alex Ovechkin, I guess I would say, that would be devastating if Tom Wilson left this team. Brian Maclellan said that he would like to see him retire here. And then when Tom Wilson was questioned about it, or in his post-game or breakdown day, he said that, I'm not going to play hardball. I'm not going to want to play anywhere else. But then he kind of had a wry smile and he said, but crazier things have happened. What was your read on that? Tom Wilson coming back to the Capitals, that seems to be of the utmost importance for me. They could take care of it this offseason. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think first of all, I think both parties want him to end up being the next captain. I think they want him to be, the pillar, to remain the pillar that he is. He's among the most unique players in the league. I mean, you can't find many players who play like him. And so, I think injuries this year kind of factored into things, and his health going forward is going to be really important. But I think he probably just wants to get, the right smile. I didn't really read into that. I just think he wants to get paid what he deserves, what the market is for him. If you look at what his value might be on the trade block, he could really accelerate a rebuild. He could really change things and command a lot of return for the Capitals. It just speaks to the player that he is. But I don't think they'd want to do that. I think they'll want to figure out something as soon as possible with him in terms of a new contract or an extension. So, just being able to be with the team here for half a season and watch him every single night, and just the different things that he does. He was one of the few guys down the stretch. I mean, just every single night, who just brought it and who never wavered in his mentality. And it was really impressive to watch. I mean, he played really well offensively. His production actually, ramped up over the final weeks of the season. He still carried his weight physically. There was kind of the interesting stretch where the officiating, he was at odds with the officiating, and there was a lot of odd calls that were going against him. And so there was a lot of frustration that boiled over, but you could just feel when you're around the team, a guy like that, what his importance is, and the way he carries himself inside the dressing room and how guys respect him. I don't think there's any doubt that, that both parties want to get it done. I just think it's probably now a matter of what the numbers are going to be and how they can figure it out. Again, I think he's right, though. I mean, crazier things have happened. I don't know what the thinking is with the front office, whether they have maybe some kind of idea of dealing him. If they did, though, I'm sure it would be considered a blockbuster, and it would be something that would set your franchise forward or set it up for the future pretty well. Albeit you'd be down a guy who could be your next captain and who has been a really important part of the franchise over the past decade.
Yeah, and the thing of it is I always think about, and it's interesting you said captain. I've always thought he could be the next captain of this team as well. Just a lot of leadership qualities, and he brings a lot of the intangibles. Some of it is if you talk to people outside the Capitals, they say, well, he's just a goon. He's just a tough guy. Not a lot of goons and tough guys can score goals with the same regularity as that he can. Last season, he was the top 3 in goals with his team. Also, that intimidation factor. Sometimes he just has to skate into an area and it'll disperse. I remember that against the Coyotes game. It was just interesting. He didn't even need to say anything. He just kind of skated into the vicinity and it broke up a potential situation. So it is an interesting thing to have him here. The thing for me is I think that if Wilson and Backstrom and Carlson had been playing all season, I think we would be talking about a wild card spot right now instead of talking about, next season and all doom and gloom. I think that is as big of an impact with Wilson, Backstrom, and Carlson. If those players were back, do you think we would be talking about the Capitals in the playoffs right now?
Probably. I mean, it's hard to say. You could see how when John Carlson came back, just how things kind of changed. They obviously didn't win every game, but the things changed on the blue line, and they were able to maneuver the power play differently and whatnot. And with Tom Wilson, yeah, I mean, it's they lost him for a stretch there in the second half, or at least waited for him to come back. And it made such a massive difference on that top line when he was there. And I think he kind of developed some chemistry down the stretch with Dylan Strome. He talked about that a little bit, and that's something to maybe look forward to next year. I don't know how many people maybe expected Strome to be the top line center, but he obviously was a revelation this year for Washington, and I think Tom Wilson down the stretch had something to do with that. I mean, there was a really good line, and I think like I said, he's a fascinating, unique player that has developed a reputation over the years, and kind of goes into every building every night and faces that, and he just does so many little things that I don't think probably people see even, and like you said, the presence he just carries can really take a lot of pressure and attention off of his teammates on the ice. And so I think that the big question mark, like I said, I think will be the injuries, keeping him healthy as he gets older, as he's 29, and as he kind of ages, keeping him healthy with the way he plays is going to be their challenge. And so I think he's excited to maybe put this season behind him and go into next year with kind of a fresh start and hopefully a new contract for him.
Yeah, he's just one of the most important guys on the team. And I don't ever want to imagine this team without Tom Wilson in the lineup, not for the foreseeable future anyway. All right, so after the break here, we're going to talk about what is the future of Nick Backstrom and Evgeny Kuznetsov on the Capitals. We'll talk about that next. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In this episode, we have Roman Stubbs of the Washington Post, Nick Backstrom, the guy that was responsible for a lot of Alex Ovechkin's goals, assisted on a lot of Alex Ovechkin's goals, another kind of leadership quality person to have on the team. And he is hopeful and he is optimistic about next season. But Brian Maclellan kind of had a different answer or a different response when questioned about Nick Backstrom's future. He was asked about if he thought he showed improvement. He said marginally yes. He said, asked if he thought Backstrom showed signs of improvement in the final weeks of the season. It's a tough thing to get through. We don't have experience observing players that have done that. I don't know what can happen in the offseason to make it significantly better. Maclellan said at some point in the coming months, it's possible Backstrom will have to make a decision on his career. Kind of a mic drop moment there and kind of a head scratcher there too. You know, you're a journalist here. What did you read that to mean? Did you see that him coming back next season, or am I reading too much into that about the question mark about Nick Backstrom's future in DC?
Yeah, well, I think they've known for some time that, you know, they're in uncharted waters here in terms of him being back. You know, Backstrom himself has said, my hip will never be the same. He's I think everybody's acknowledged that he maybe will never be the same player again. I think what they're trying to figure out is what level he can get back to. Backstrom did talk about how this offseason would be one of the first in a while that he's just been able to go in and start immediately working out and you know, preparing without some, you know, major procedure or surgery scheduled. And so I think that he was optimistic about that. In terms of the comment, yeah, I think everybody would probably acknowledge that Backstrom wasn't the same this year, and that they don't know, you know, they don't know what kind of progress he's going to be able to make this offseason, if he's going to be able to really improve. And I think I think the way I interpreted it was, you know, Backstrom's obviously not going to walk away from his contract and the money he's due. But he's going to have to make I think a determination at some point. If the progress isn't, you know, if he's not able to progress the way he wants to, he's going to have to be able to make a decision on whether he wants to keep playing or not. And it's going to put I think the Capitals in an interesting position just because of his contract, and kind of what they want to do with their lineup. Guys they want to move up, bring in, you know, this rebuilding effort that they're undertaking. You know, the way he fits into that, I don't know. And so I fully expect him to be back for training camp. Where he goes from there and what kind of player he is and whether we see tangible improvement from what he looked like this season, I think is the mystery, and the unknown that you know, obviously nobody knows. And so that's the way I interpret it from McClellan, is that you know, I think they both want to see where he's at the end of the summer, and eventually Backstrom's going to have to make a decision on his career, and throw that into a new coach taking over and what he wants. It's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out for sure.
Yeah, and a tough thing, you got to think that, you know, he would have to run that one by Ovi first. And it was interesting that Maclellan said that oftentimes he will bounce things off Ovi, being that he is the captain. And, you know, he should have some input on it at the end of the day. So the next player we're going to talk about here is Evgeny Kuznetsov. Of course, the comments that he made earlier about wanting to be out of DC by Russian media, that he shot down those comments. But then we've heard that he's actually asked to be traded a couple times in previous seasons. Now, talking about the head coaching change, there is a belief out there that Peter Laviolette didn't properly utilize Evgeny Kuznetsov. I've even heard some people say the same thing about Mantha, that if they had the right coach, maybe they could squeeze a little bit more juice out of that orange. So what is your thoughts on Evgeny Kuznetsov? Did he play his last season in DC? And does he have a higher ceiling? Because just taking a look at him statistically, Maclellan called Kuznetsov's season disappointing. The 30-year-old scored 12 goals a year after putting up 24 and finished a team worst in minus 26. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think, obviously he's not going to. We asked him about the report out of Russia multiple times, after it had happened, and then obviously the other day. And he's not commenting on that. It does raise the question of what exactly happened, what's been happening behind the scenes in terms of trade requests, and what maybe Brian Maclellan is thinking. My thought is that it's going to be awfully difficult for them to move that contract. But at the same time, I think that Evgeny Kuznetsov has shown that he's capable of bouncing back. I mean, I think that maybe is something for the organization to weigh is whether or not he can, maybe a new coaching staff coming in and kind of the pressure of coming back from a down season in which he faced a ton of criticism and his numbers were not good. Whether he can really come back like he did a year ago, or at least last season, and kind of rebound. And so I think that maybe it's the same situation with Anthony Mantha, although Mantha will be in the final year of his contract and obviously playing for another one. It's going to be fascinating to see if the Capitals do try to move him this summer. My impression is that it will be difficult to move that money, but there's probably ways around it. With that being said, Kuznetsov, in terms of what you'd get back for him, the value you'd get back for him, he does have a couple provisions in his contract that, the 10-team no trade clause, there's things like that to navigate, which make it additionally difficult. But what you would get back for him in comparison to the ceiling that he has, and the maybe the thought of him giving him one last chance to turn this around and have another bounce back year, and maybe see if it was a situation where he just wasn't responding well to Laviolette's style or his staff. It'll be fascinating to see. I think we all are well aware of what Evgeny Kuznetsov is really capable of. He was the centerpiece of that Stanley Cup run, and over the years has shown flashes of brilliance, and but he's also really shown a lot of inconsistency, and so I think Maclellan is going to have to weigh that, and whether he can get fair value and be able to move that that $7.8 million contract.
Yeah, that one probably won't be so easy to move there. It might have to be one of those bundle deals where, you put him and Mantha, or, someone in, that's why they have GMs to make these difficult decisions. And we can just look at it and go, wow, that was really good. Or, hey, I would have done that differently. It's a tough job to have. But Roman, I want to thank you so much for joining us once again on this edition of Locked On Capitals. Of course, you write for the Washington Post, but where can we find you online?
Yeah, well, I'm just at Washington Post Sports. I have an author profile page there. I'm also on Twitter at Roman Stubbs, just my name, one word. Usually post all my work. So thanks so much for having me, Dan. I appreciate it.
All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it's your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.